Welcome. Thanks for being here. I'm Connie Ryan, Executive Director of Interfaith Alliance of Iowa. This is Intersections, and this is our second time being back together after a very long hiatus of only being online, and I'm really glad to see a lot of folks in the room, and there's a lot of folks online as well. And so welcome to those folks who are joining us online, really from all over the state, which is a great thing about technology that we've learned in the pandemic. It's one of the few things that we have benefited from in that, but we're really glad to have you here. Intersections is a monthly luncheon typically, and you all are bringing your lunch if you have chosen to. And the planning committee is going to meet after today's Intersections, and we're going to talk about the fall. So we won't be meeting again until September for Intersections, and we're going to figure out the food part, and we're going to figure out the programs for next year. And the planning team really has always done an excellent job on all of that, and really bringing the voices of Cedar Rapids into the conversation on what's of interest in your community. So we are glad to be partners in that work. I'm very excited to have Senator Rob Hogg with us today. He has served in the Iowa Senate, well, in the Iowa Legislature for 20 years. I don't really know I didn't look to see your bio, sorry. Because we know him so well, and we just asked him to talk about his experience in the legislature and what he's learned from that and what he's taken away from that and what he wants to leave there, probably a little bit of also, and just to learn from him as well. Here's the stories. Our process for Intersections is that he'll talk for a little while, and then we'll open it up to questions. So you can be thinking about what those questions are, and then I bring the microphone around. You'll just raise your hand, and I'll bring the microphone around to you so that everybody can hear you, including those folks who are online. And if you're online, you can ask questions also by putting your question in the comments, and if there are any, then we'll ask those directly to Senator Hogg. So, Senator Rob Hogg, thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everybody, and I've turned this on, so hopefully you can hear okay. Is everybody hearing okay? Connie's not sure. Connie's not sure. Yes, okay. And for those of you who are watching on live television, welcome and good to have you with us. I hope you're all having a good day. Today I got 2 loads of laundry done. I deleted some emails, a lot of emails. I ate my breakfast, read the paper, bathed, dressed, tweeted for Fridays for the Future, and prepared this talk. I had hoped to get the dishes washed and retrieve the trash cans, but sometimes sacrifices have to be made for the Interfaith Alliance and Intersections. So I want to start my reflection on 20 years in the Iowa Legislature on things that the legislature did with my help that I was a part of and that I feel good about. The biggest accomplishment was helping Iowa rebuild after the flood of 2008. And by the way, for those of you who think that might have been a given, you might look at what the legislature and the state did after the flood of 2011 or the flood of 2019. But anyway, I was proud that we did that we helped Iowa rebuild after the flood of 2008, and that we did it in a way that was smarter, safer, and more sustainable than what was before. And that included the highest priority, which was getting housing for people who had lost their homes. It also included the creation of the Iowa Flood Center at the University of Iowa, watershed management authorities to try to bring communities and counties together for watershed management. Doesn't get much attention, but we helped rebuild the University of Iowa campus, which was very important. And we created in 2012 the Iowa Flood Mitigation to help communities like Dubuque and Waverly reduce flood damage in floods that have occurred since they finished their flood mitigation projects. Other accomplishments. One of my first accomplishments was to help update Iowa's child safety seat law in 2004. I remember former Representative Faggy will remember those times. I went over, one of my jobs was to try to match up one Republican for one Democrat on the bill to sponsor it in the House. And Vicki Lensing was the lead Democrat, but I told Vicki I'd help find some other Republicans and Democrats. And I went over and asked former State Trooper Clell Baudler if he would sign on to a bill to strengthen Iowa's child safety seat law. And Representative Baudler said, strengthen? No. Update? Yes. So I said, would you sign on to a bill to update Iowa's child safety seat law? And he said, yes, I will. So that's how Representative Baudler became a co-sponsor of that bill, and we passed it. And probably saved some lives by doing that. We raised the minimum wage in 2007. We raised the tobacco tax to help reduce tobacco use. Representative Fagie's bill. That's why I looked at him. You see, in the legislature, you always take credit for everything you did, but then you always have to remember that other people actually did it too, or did it more. We passed the statewide smoke-free law. One of the arguments I made on that was, Iowa as a whole state isn't any bigger than the city of Chicago, so why don't we just do it statewide? And that actually somehow prevailed. I'm not quite sure how that prevailed. Representative Fahey probably remembers better than I do the ins and outs on how that happened, but the debate was, should we do it statewide or should we do it community by community? We added protections for LGBTQ Iowans to the state's civil rights law. We started a STEM education project, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics with what we called the Corridor STEM Initiative in 2007, and it was so immediately popular that it went statewide in 2008. We created the statewide preschool program. We built biorenewable research facilities at Iowa State and biomedical research facilities at the University of Iowa. We expanded the Hawkeye program to cover 60,000 more kids for children's health insurance. And in 2013, in divided government, we found a way to expand Medicaid to cover another 150,000 people through the Iowa Health and Wellness Program. In divided government, in 2013, we passed a solar energy tax credit that has led to several thousand solar projects across the state in all 99 counties, well over $100 million invested, and it actually helped create an industry in Iowa that employs 1,000 people today that didn't exist just 9 years ago. They all deserve applause. They all deserve applause. And then here was one that was sort of my, if you were to ask me what was my signature legislative accomplishment that actually required some lawyering on my part. Senator Mathis said on the floor of the Senate when we were doing my retirement resolution that I actually wrote my own bills. And like with everything, that was kind of actually true. Because everything was written by the Legislative Services Agency. But there were times when I asserted myself. And I would actually write what I thought the way was to handle it. And this was an example of it. We repealed a draconian law that said that if you had HIV and you engaged in conduct that had the potential to transmit HIV, that you were a Class B felon facing 25 years in prison. And we repealed that law and replaced it with a graduated law based on actual intent and actual consequences with a safe harbor for people who followed public health guidance. And that was a good accomplishment. And I will say that I feel good about that list of accomplishments I've just shared with you. I'm sure there are others. But with few exceptions, all of those accomplishments have survived the last 6 years of Republican-controlled government. So I feel good about that. The last 6 years have been tough, with Republican bills that have hurt workers' rights, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and the very foundations of our democracy, voting rights and public education. So, I'm happy to take questions about anything. I'm going to share a few more lessons that might not be as specifically directed towards legislative accomplishments, but just some observations. Let me do it this way. Observations on life and public service. First, war makes me sick to my stomach. My first session down there, I watched too much television as George W. Bush launched the Iraq War. Yuck. And sadly, I'm finishing my legislative career watching Vladimir Putin attack Ukraine. More yuck. Ukraine has a size, population, a geographical size and population size comparable to Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa combined. And when I see today's war footage, it feels like Chicago and the suburbs and our farm fields are under attack. And it really makes me sick. We urgently need peace to safeguard people and property and the resources we need to address other problems. Think about the damage Superstorm Sandy did to the United States. Bad. And then look at what Putin has done to Ukraine. So many more lives lost and so much more damage, and it's just egregious. A second observation, climate action is more urgent than ever. 20 years ago, when I first ran for the office, it sounds like there's popcorn in the kitchen. For those of you watching on television, you hear that little popping noise in the back. It's going to make me hungry just thinking about it. Anyway, when I was first a candidate, carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were 375 parts per million in April 2002. 375. And, you know, we had this feeling that climate change was happening and was going to get worse, but we didn't really feel like you could attribute any particular disaster to climate change. That was generally the state of things in 2002. Well, 20 years later, it's not 375 parts per million anymore. It's over 420 parts per million. In just 20 years, more than 12% higher global atmospheric carbon dioxide. And the science has changed to the point now, it's called attribution science, where scientists don't hesitate to say this event likely or very likely would not have occurred but for human-induced global warming. So that hasn't been good. That's not good. And it does make me feel sometimes like I have failed on what I consider to be my central purpose in running for office. But then I think to myself, well, one person isn't responsible for anything other than trying to do their best, and I think I've done my best. But it doesn't change the fact that somehow, some way, we urgently need to take action to slow down, stop, and reverse climate pollution. The scientists tell us, remember, carbon dioxide levels are going up, emissions have gone up, the rate of increase has gone up, and the science tells us we need to cut annual climate pollution by 50% or more by 2030 in just 8 years on a pathway to net zero emissions by 2050, just to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. The science also tells us simultaneously we urgently need to protect and restore nature and biodiversity in order to sustain human civilization. As I wrote in my 2013 book, which is also one of the highlights of my legislative career, if we don't do these things, everything else we care about will prove to be nothing more than rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. So, got to act on climate change. Now, third observation, and I have to remind the handful of people in Iowa who are as motivated on climate change as I am, I have to remind them this occasionally. There are other important public issues too, right? just because we have to act on climate change doesn't mean the other things we care about aren't important. And remember, elected officials have to deal with hundreds of issues, thousands of constituents, and for some of us, the nearly constant need to campaign. So you just start down the list of issues: public safety, public health, healthcare, poverty, education, workers' rights, disability services, criminal justice reform, individual rights, animal welfare. I could go on, but you name it, these are important, and they're important to people, and they're important to a lot of people. So you need to appreciate that full range. Okay, a little change in direction a little bit for another observation, my fourth. Think about what other people are hearing when you speak. This is an increasing problem. I'm just going to tell you. This was not the same degree of problem in 2002 when I first ran as it is today. So I'll give you an example. Well, it's not my example, but I was at an event in Ottumwa for a Democratic meeting in 2017, and we got a question and had a discussion about LGBTQ rights. And it was a good discussion. And the very next question we got was, well, I don't hear you ever talking about workers' rights. Well, LGBTQ rights are workers' rights, right? And they are important. And it doesn't mean that we were ignoring workers' rights by talking about LGBTQ rights. I was glad I was there to address that, right? But it's a recurring problem that if somebody hears you talk about something that they don't care about, they feel as if you're not talking about the things that they care about. I'll give you another example. I was speaking on the Senate floor a few years ago about bringing Iowans together for clean water in a point of personal privilege, and I talked about how we all have a role to play in cleaning up Iowa's water, and a Republican senator stood up in a point of personal privilege and said he was tired of me attacking Iowa farmers. I didn't say anything negative about Iowa farmers. So, was it that he didn't hear what I was saying, or was it that he decided to take my comments more cynically as a way to make a cynical point? I actually had this happen to me in what may be the last thing I ever say on the floor of the Iowa Senate. We were having a strange and probably misguided discussion about why the legislative session went to June 30th in 2011 after 2010 when Democrats had adjourned on March 29th. And I pointed out factually that Democrats left the state in 2010, the last year of our trifecta, with a general fund surplus of over $300 million. We were not deficit spending. We were fiscally sound. In hindsight, I think the correct analysis is Governor Culver cut too much spending in 2010. But I was just sharing this as a factual observation, which led a Republican senator, in a point of personal privilege, to say that I was lying and Democrats had left the state in a budget mess. I think they like having me speak so they can get after me because I'm a lawyer and a Democrat from Cedar Rapids, and that's a favored boogeyman for Republicans. Okay, so just as important, a fifth observation. So I just said, think about how other people are hearing you. Think about whether Iowans across the state are able to hear you. We're having a nice meeting in Cedar Rapids today. Thank you all for being here. And thank you to those of you joining us on television across Iowa and around the world. But is there a meeting today in Fort Dodge, Sioux City, Osage, Waterloo, Burlington, Ottumwa, and I could go on. When I started in the Iowa legislature in 2003, Emmetsburg in northwest Iowa was represented by a Democratic state representative, Marcy Freevert, and a Democratic state senator, Jack Kibbe. Marcy and I lived on the same floor in the same hotel, and she was there with her husband, Dr. Freevert, and Marcy would educate me about things. She told me that in Emmetsburg, the Des Moines Register was the most trusted news source. It's what people read when they wanted to know the news. And I would venture to say that is no longer the case. Where are people getting their news? Here's another little anecdote, and I don't mean to be too partisan here, but it's a factual observation. Democrats in the Iowa legislature today represent only some or all of 24 of Iowa's 99 counties, meaning there are 75 counties that are only represented in the Iowa legislature by Republicans. What do those Iowans who live in the other 75 counties hear about Democrats, and what do they hear about the legislature? This is one of the reasons why it's important to support organizations like the Interfaith Alliance that have some capacity for a statewide reach. And it would be nice to be able to do more. Next observation. I'm doing okay time-wise, just barely. Civic institutions that provide stability need our support. It takes a lot of work. I just joined the vestry at our church. Boy, that's time consuming. And it has its share of politics. But faith groups, nonprofits, businesses and business groups that aren't kooky right-wingers like the Pillow Guy. So the other businesses, they need our support. I did see in the news this week that Governor Branstad, former Governor Branstad, believes that the existing Chamber of Commerce is too moderate. So he is starting a new chamber organization called the American Free Enterprise Chamber of Commerce. I really dislike the fact that so many super wealthy people can spend a small fraction of their fortune on political ideology. And I do wonder who's going to get the money to run Governor Branstad's new organization. It's pretty hard to compete with if the other side's funding itself with fake sales. Okay, seventh observation, engage practically in politics. I liked the recent meme I saw going around that said this: a vote is not a Valentine. You aren't confessing your love for a candidate. It's a chess move for the world you want to live in. So I like to tell people to caucus and vote in the primaries and make sure other people you know are involved in both parties. A former Republican told me she left the party after a caucus in 2008 because she and her family thought those people were nuts. I agree, that's a good reason to leave a party. But what happens when the good people leave and all that's left is the nuts? And I actually believe there are some people who probably think that about Democrats. No offense to all of you who are actively involved in the Democratic caucus process, I just share that observation. There are two ways that the Republican Party will come back to believing in democracy and compassionate government. One option is they lose a bunch of elections in a row, and so, a la Democrats in 1992, they feel the need to reinvent themselves, like Bill Clinton reinvented the Democratic Party in 1992 and won. That's one option. The other option is get more good people to endure the nuts and try to take back the Republican Party. And I think both should be tried. My own opinion. Final 8th observation, and I'm going to leave it on this note. And I say this, well, I'm just going to say what I've kind of written out here, and just think about it. I'm not going to say anything I've said today is finally refined, right? I'm just giving you observations. Speak up and engage in public life with love. And I'm saying this partly as a reminder to myself, because boy, do I feel things when I see bad things happening. Partly I say this because in reference to what I said earlier, I think if you speak up with love, it's one of the ways that people might actually hear what you're saying. Might. And partly I say it because I believe that love is probably the only force that can overcome hate. I don't think yelling, anger, or even righteous indignation is going to change the direction Iowa is going. I want to validate the feelings for people who are feeling those things. But we do need to be honest with our feelings. But I don't think it can sustain effective action. Love can. Love can sustain effective action. So I'm going to finish with a quote about love from a book on climate change that I'm reading. This is called Saving Us, a Climate Scientist's Case for Hope and Healing in a Divided World. The author is Texas Tech professor living in that hotbed of climate activism, Lubbock, Texas, who says that making people feel guilt, fear, and shame is not effective. Quote, so how do we move beyond fear or shame? By acting from love, I believe. Love starts with speaking truth, making people fully aware of the risks and the choices they face in a manner that is relevant and practical to them. But it also offers compassion, understanding, and acceptance, the opposite of guilt and shame. Love bolsters our courage too. What will we not do for the people and the places that we love? And finally, it opens the door to that most ephemeral and sought after of emotions, hope. I'll take any questions you have.
Thank you, Senator. And just raise your hand as Libby is demonstrating, and I will bring the microphone to you.
Rob, I'd like you to talk more about how bills are written. You mentioned the Legislative Services Bureau. You said that writes the bills. Could you, though, say where some of those bills originate? You must be a rarity in that you actually penned, your own bill. You made us believe that's rare. And then I think of groups like ALEC and other groups when bills appear in legislatures all over the country and they're the same recipe.
Yes.
So how does that all work?
All right. So the question for those who didn't hear it is about how does the bill writing or bill drafting process happen? And it really can be this simple, which is I say to a staff person who then turns it over to the Legislative Services Agency, I'd like a bill on a tariff to promote solar power. And then the drafter takes those instructions and tries to figure it out. And sometimes the bill drafting process can take a while because you're waiting for bills to get drafted. Other times it might be, I'd like a bill modeled on X, Y, or Z. And that's where you'll see the ALEC bills showing up. Not always, not usually verbatim, because Iowa has different styles, and so the drafters will change those bills to conform, usually change them to conform to Iowa styles. There have been a few instances where ALEC bills have just kind of come in without all those styles being adjusted for. And the same goes with amendments. So I want an amendment on something, I tell a staff person tells the drafter, and then you wait. Lots of times you have the debates in the Senate or the House. Well, in the Senate, in the House, they don't allow amendments to be filed from the floor. They have to be filed the day in advance, usually, not at the end of the session, but usually. In the Senate, we can file from the floor. So we'll start a debate, we'll defer for an amendment, and 6 hours later, we'll have an amendment that kind of does what we want it to do, but it's as good as we're going to get, so let's go with it, right? It is an interesting process. Some of you may have paid attention to the recent Supreme Court case in Iowa that was ruling on whether a candidate had valid signatures, right? Well, that bill was written by the Legislative Service Agency drafters in the process that I just described. Did the floor manager of that bill for the Republicans have a conception of whether they wanted the date to be required for each signature or not? Possibly, but that's, as the Supreme Court ruled, that's not the way the bill was actually drafted. They said it was required, but in the remedy section, they didn't include the lack of a valid date on a signature. So the Supreme Court said, well, there's kind of an internal contradiction. We're going to go with the longstanding prior law and do that. So that's kind of the way that process works. What I did differently on this bill was in working with the Legislative Service Agency on this bill to repeal this HIV criminal penalty law, which I knew was highly sensitive. We're in divided government. I knew I had to get through a Republican House. I also knew I had members in my caucus who had some specific concerns. I had to inject myself and tell the LSA drafter, this is how I want this done, right? And it was particularly true on trying to come up with a safe harbor for people who followed public health guidance without saying what that public health guidance was, because that would have created a controversy that would have made it difficult for me to pass. So I incorporated public health guidance by reference that I'd found. I told the drafter to do that, and that's what we did. But it can be a very subtle process. Here's the larger point. The legislature is not full of lawyers, and just because somebody's a lawyer doesn't mean they know about drafting, right? It's lots of lawyers have lots of different skills, not necessarily legislative drafting. Happens to be this is something I kind of have a little more experience with. Best class I had in law school was my legislation class. Great class. Okay. But that's why a lot of the bills sort of sometimes feel like they're just kind of an expression of a feeling. And that's reflective of our politics today. Just to make the larger point, the specifics, the details, they don't necessarily matter in the public debate. I want to know whose side you're on. Right? That's what politics now has become, and it's like, well, yeah, that's part of it. You know, you want to know people's values, but on the other hand, you also want to see skills and competence and something that lifts people up rather than pitting people against each other. Back here.
Senator, why did you decide to retire and why now? Or actually, why 2 years ago?
Well, that's a longer issue, and I will just say that if you really want to watch the fullest public statement about that, if you find my comments on my retirement resolution, you'll get to hear about it, because I did go into detail on that. Let me give you the short version, which is, after 20 years, after learning that the world doesn't revolve around me, I look at Representative Fahey on that because he knows some of the history on that. Representative Stade. I decided there were young people in my district who wanted to run, and they should have the chance. So let's leave it at that for now. It is obviously more complicated than that, but I'm excited about the people who are running in my district. And you know what? They know, I said on the, I had one other more thing. I said on the floor, in 2002, I brought my 1980s style campaign and I won by 585 votes. Well, the 1980s style campaign is now 40 years out of date, and I'm not sure. I think maybe it's time to let some other people give it a whirl. So who's next? Linda.
Well, Mr. Hogg, I wanted to say I appreciate so much your recognizing with your opening remarks the accomplishments of what the Iowa legislature and yourself have accomplished, everything. But I also want to just ask, how do we all get out of this depression or out of this mindset of sometimes not having a lot of hope about how Iowa can maybe change into the two parties that will work together again, or what I think a number of us might feel that now we're really living in a red state. And what can we do? What have you done for yourself to keep yourself optimistic or not being depressed?
There's my answer to that question. Next question. I feel what you've just described quite often, right? I'm not going to sugarcoat that. It does feel very discouraging at times. Okay. I've already kind of said it a little bit. Two things. First of all, there is a future, and it could be very, very bright. I'm excited about the people who are running in my district. There are other candidates I'm excited about who are running in the state. And I think, well, partly that's the answer, right? New people, new enthusiasm. Let's go with it. Second, I tried to give you some observations about what needs to be done, in my opinion, to change it. We have to find a way so that Iowans across the state can hear, right? We've got to be mindful of what they're hearing. We have to find a way to communicate across the state here, what to hear. We have to say it in a way that they can hear it. And it's very tricky because that might not be your initial feeling about it, right? Because your initial feeling is going to be, no, they can't do this. That's bad. And all I would say is, and those feelings are, I want to validate your feelings, Linda. I want to validate them, okay? But think about what we say and what we do, and is it designed to create a supermajority of Iowans who want and believe in this better future together, right? We have to welcome people in, invite people in. Our language has to invite people in. Our rhetoric has to invite people in. We have to say something some places just so people know that we care about them, and then we can invite them in, right? And I think that's part of the solution.
Rob,
Yes,
it's
Helene.
Mental Health Awareness Month.
Yes.
I'd like to know how legislation around mental health has changed over the years, and what have we done about stigma?
Stigma. Let's start with that. There is no stigma. If somebody has a mental health condition, that's no different than any other condition. It's fine. There are people that help, get help. There are people who want to support you. You deserve support, right? I think we've made more progress addressing the stigma than we have on the policies to actually provide better mental health services in general. That's my opinion. Others may have a different perception on it. We've done a lot of reforming of the mental health system. We've done a lot of changing of health insurance as it affects mental health. And I think on balance, it's probably better. So when we expanded Medicaid, for example, that did help make mental health more accessible for a lot of people. Mental health care, that was good. When the Branstad-Reynolds administration privatized the administration of Medicaid, that was kind of a step back for mental health services. The regionalization of services might have helped in some places. I think in Lynn County, it's generally hurt. But there is no stigma. It's fine. I've seen a counselor. There's nothing wrong with seeing a counselor. People, if they need help, should get help. Yes.
Rob, I'd be interested in your observation on public education. When you came in 2002, my perception is that there was pretty strong support across the board, and it seems to have just gone down, down, down until where we're at today. And why that's happened and where we're at today.
Kevin, yeah, I will repeat the question. The question was about public education and how legislative support for public education has changed over the 20 years. And first of all, let me start by saying when I first ran for office in 2002, and this is also true for Representative Stade, when you first ran in 04, 06, Art Stade stands for education. That was the theme, right? And I said, when James Lynch first asked me why I was running, I said, education, the environment, fiscal responsibility. That was my response. There was energy around Iowa's education system. And the other thing Democrats did not do is we didn't pit public education against private education, right? We recognize the role for public schools. It's the foundation of our democracy. So we were very, very supportive of public schools and always will be, but we weren't hostile to private education. Never have been. You know, some people didn't like it, but I voted for the charitable giving for school tuition organizations. I don't know how many times I've voted to fund school transportation, the textbook credit, right? We do lots of things to support private education, but it's not at the expense of public education. And what has changed now is the voucher proposal is actually a proposal to divert public resources away from the public schools and give them to private schools, which will dramatically hurt public education if it becomes law, and it should not. Just to give you a little inside baseball, in 2018, when Republicans were passing their first largest tax cut in Iowa's history, I think we're on version number 3 or 4 now. Every year they like to pass the largest tax cut in Iowa's history. By the way, my state taxes keep going up and up, so I must be in the wrong income bracket for that. But I said to then State Senator Randy Feenstra, who is the chair of the Ways and Means Committee now in Congress, I said, Randy, why don't you skip the tax cut bill and fund your private school scholarship plan? Rather than taking money away from the public schools to give it to the private schools, just skip the tax cut and fund the private schools. That way everybody wins. And to his credit, Randy thought, at least briefly, about that. Here's my concern on the question you asked, and I'm starting to feel it again. But in 2002, 2004, 2006, schools and state funding of schools and support for public education and things like our STEM initiative and preschool and things to make it better, that was a driving force in Iowa politics. And it has not been a driving force in Iowa politics probably since the Tea Party began to body snatch the Republican Party in 2010. But even on the Democratic side, the enthusiasm has waned, but I feel it resurging again, right? Probably because of the threat that the voucher program poses to public education. And we need to do that, right? We need to say we need world-class schools from preschool all the way to college and job training. We need that in Iowa because it's what Iowa's about, or at least what Iowa used to be about, and hopefully will be about someday again.
So this question goes a little bit to the question about optimism,
Yeah.
pessimism, and actually now to your education. And to Tom Vilsack, his brief run for president, he said Democrats shouldn't give up on rural America. And we're from Mount Vernon, so we used to always have a Democratic whatever representatives, and now we're with rural Delaware County, Jones County.
Mhm.
And on the last election, I asked somebody who asked me to write a letter for our local politician. And I said, well, give me something that will speak to the farmers, why they should vote for a Democrat. And that person never answered me. And that goes to education. Actually, I think Charlie McClintock is one of the few Republicans who isn't supportive of vouchers because it's bad for our district, our state representative district. So I want to know if you had one thing that the Democrats had that they could offer rural Iowans better than the Republicans, what would that one thing be?
Do I have 3 days to prepare an answer? I'm going to give you a few things. Number one, are you worried about the giant sucking sound where we have 70 counties in Iowa losing population? I am, and have been for, by the way, that's not because of the farm crisis of the 1980s. As I look around this audience, I can see we have a few people who can remember the farm crisis of the 1980s, right? This is just since 2010. We have 70 counties losing population. So, number one answer is what Republicans have been doing hasn't been working. Number two, you want good, strong public schools in rural Iowa? You better support good, strong public schools. Answer number three, you want clean water in rural Iowa? You need to support clean water initiatives if you want clean water. You want good health care in rural Iowa? Senator Peterson from Des Moines, who has made a large part of her career dedicated to issues of maternal health. I can't remember that 18 maternity wards have closed in Iowa in the last.
More than that. It's more than that.
It's more than 18. I mean, it's a huge number. So if you want to have a family, okay, here's your hour-long drive to the hospital in the city. You measure after measure after measure. We could do better in rural Iowa if you thought of government as a way, as a tool to make life better for people. The problem is if government's the boogeyman, you can't do that. And so then you're on your own, and if your kids all decide to leave, right? And if the farms consolidate and the jobs that are left are low-wage farmhand or low-wage food processing jobs, it's not going to be the vision that you want for your community. I do want to say one other thing. With all due respect, Governor Vilsack was wrong when he said that. What did you say he said?
Democrats shouldn't give up on rural America.
Democrats shouldn't give up on rural America suggesting that Democrats had given up on rural America. Governor Vilsack was wrong about that. Democrats have never given up on rural America. Tactically, are there things we should be doing that would be better and more effective? Yes. Right? Do you remember in the 2016 campaign when Hillary Clinton came and had an event in Cedar Rapids? Do you remember that? Okay. Do you remember in the 2020 campaign when Joe Biden came and had an event in Des Moines? I was sitting there going, no! Go where you would have gone in a caucus. And so this time, when President Biden comes back, did he come to Des Moines? No. He went to Menlo in Cass County, Guthrie County, one of those western counties. Needless to say, I didn't go, right? I wasn't there. Wasn't on the invitation list. Wouldn't have gone even if it had been on the invitation list. Didn't want to drive out there. I've seen President Biden before. I love President Biden. Thank God for President Biden. But see what I'm saying? So you can't say Democrats have forgotten to do something about, no, we're there, we care. Okay, thank you. Okay, another question. We're coming up.
Charles Crawley from Cedar Rapids here.
Yes.
I just wanted to make a comment, and that's to thank you because you've been the best politician that I have ever known.
Okay. Hi.
Hi.
You know about the constitutional amendment that's going to be on the ballot this year of the with strict scrutiny about the gun bill?
Yes.
And I know that it is going to be really bad for Iowans in a lot of ways. The 3 states that have passed it with the strict scrutiny so far have had a lot of money tied, or courts are tied up with cases coming through again, taxpayer money. It's really expensive. The Republicans are going to make it look like it's just a regular Second Amendment, and it is not, because it's going to make it really hard to pass any sensible gun laws. And here in Cedar Rapids, we're having a lot of gun violence. So I just wondered what your thoughts on that are and what we can do about it.
Thank you. The question's about the upcoming constitutional amendment that will be on the ballot in November. This one is to add a provision in Iowa's Constitution that says that gun ownership is a fundamental individual right and will be subject to a judicially created concept known as strict scrutiny for any law that would interfere with that fundamental individual right. I don't plan to vote for it. I have said I support the Second Amendment. I would have supported adding the language of the Second Amendment to Iowa's Constitution. I do not support something that is so extreme and goes so much beyond what the Second Amendment itself says. I do think there are 2 sort of important messages on the relationship between people and guns that should be said. Number 1, no Democrat that I can remember in my 20 years in the Iowa legislature has had any proposal to take away firearms from law-abiding citizens. It's one of these boogeyman issues that other people create. And remember, if you only hear from the sides that raise the boogeyman issue, it's pretty hard to think there's another side of the story. So, so that's one thing that needs to be said. Democrats very strong pro-hunting record and pro-gun ownership for people who are law-abiding citizens who want to own guns. The second thing that just needs to be said as a matter of public education is the person most likely to die from a gun, if you own a gun, is you yourself or somebody in your family. Because the leading cause of gun deaths in our state, in our country, are gun suicides. And it is, I'm going to get emotional thinking about it because I know people who have died of suicide by firearms. And, you know, you think back in hindsight and you kind of wish the family hadn't owned the gun. Doesn't mean the person wouldn't have found another way to kill himself or herself, but it would have been at least another barrier to that having happened. And I'm a very strong proponent of gun safety, very disappointed with the Republican legislation that has taken away gun safety legislation under the guise of it somehow infringing on a person's Second Amendment rights. It's very disappointing.
Okay, I was raised in Des Moines, suburban woman. I'm married to a Republican family farm boy, okay, who now lives in Cedar Rapids. The question that my husband always brings up is the farm subsidies. He says, I don't know why farms are still getting subsidies even in the good days. And he says, as long as all my buddies are getting a farm subsidy, they're never going to vote for Democrat. They're getting paid for their vote. Is there ever going to be a plan to question how long farm subsidies go? Because if you get online, which I hope everybody has, to read each individual business and how much they get, it's, to me, I was shocked. Because it's all public information.
It is. I'm gonna give you two quick responses here in the interest of time. One is, anybody heard of a woman named Jane Klebb, who's the chair of the Nebraska Democratic Party? Okay. She has a book about rural America and Democrats, and there was a great section of the book about how in the 1980s Democrats were engaged in rural America doing all these great things, and the motivating issue was Ronald Reagan's failure to subsidize farms because he was trying to control the deficit. That was one of the, in Jane's version, one of the motivating issues. And I'm like, wow. Then you fast forward to what Trump did after he creates a trade war that drives commodity prices down, and he just adds to the deficit to basically pay people for a trade war that he caused. Oh boy, that's hard, right? I believe in a farm safety net. I believe American farmers are innovative, entrepreneurial. I think they can provide leadership to help us solve problems like climate change. I think the United States and the war in Ukraine is certainly highlighting the need for this. The United States ought to be a food or grain reservoir for the world. Okay? So I don't think any Democrat has said, in Iowa at least, has said we ought to get rid of support for farmers. The question is, how do you structure that support to maximize to achieve important public goals, right? This is where Trump, just let's add $16 billion to the deficit and get nothing in return for it except a monetary cash handout to people. That's not good public policy. Good public policy might say, well, 16 billion is not enough, it should be more, but here are the benefits we're going to get for ecosystem services, for fighting climate change, for creating a stronger, healthier local food system, and for providing that grain reservoir service for the world. So don't fall into this. I don't mean to pick on you, but are you for the subsidies or against them? I'm for farmers. I'm for good public policy. I'm for clean water, public health, dealing with climate change, and making sure nobody in the world, and certainly nobody in Iowa, is food insecure, by the way, as Republicans in the Iowa legislature pass bill after bill to attack food security. Okay? So don't look at that, don't look at what Trump did and say, that makes me mad at farmers. It can make you mad at Trump, but that doesn't make me, don't say that makes me mad at farmers. Say, that's not good public policy. What we should do to help farmers is X, Y, or Z. Share that better alternative.
Senator Hogg, I wanted to publicly show my appreciation for your work. I want to thank you for your leadership over all these years, and particularly for your care and compassion for our constituents. You've always been there for them and always listened to them. Also appreciate your work between the House and the Senate, always working on the things that are best for the community. Just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Thank you, Art.
You're not only a great senator, but you're a good man.
Thank you very much.
And I think on that note from Representative Art Stade, we will end. Thank you, Senator Rob Hogg, for speaking today, but mostly thank you for all of your public service. And thank you for those who are online with us. And to the question about guns and the constitutional amendment, I will just tell you that there's a coalition working together to defeat the gun amendment. Interfaith Alliance is one of the lead organizations, as well as Iowans for Gun Safety and a whole bunch of organizations. And so you can find information about that at Iowans for Responsible Gun Laws. Sorry, I should know this. Iowans for Responsible Gun Laws, both on Facebook and on a website, IowansForResponsibleGunLaws.com. And you will be seeing more information about that and a lot of work about that post-primary, because we decided to really launch that after the primary and not confuse people. So definitely learn about that issue. And really our focus is the impact if a constitutional amendment were to be passed. So just wanted to say that to follow up with Selma's point. So thank you, Senator. Appreciate all of your work.